Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be back here, though. It really is. And I just want to thank Open for starting this. This is a really impressive start to this. I really had no idea how this would go. And every step along the way has been really beautifully planned and organized and inspiring. And there's so many people to thank. I know Ben thanked a lot of people, but I would like to give a special shout out to Frank Biafora, who really was the one who put this together on my side. So thank you, Frank. So I'm going to walk through some Florida stories for you. We're going to talk about criminal justice. We're going to talk about race. We're going to talk about law. We're going to talk about U.S. history. It's all told through the narrative of a crime story. Each one of the stories I write are basically done that way. And I think by looking at it through the lens of a crime story and that kind of narrative, you can really shine a brighter light on some of the other parts of American life, which is race, the criminal justice system, civil rights, politics, history, economics. I think when you read these crime stories, you'll really get a better understanding of where we were, not just as a state in Florida, but as a nation. And with that in mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about both books. I'm going to start out with Devil in the Grove, the book that took place in 1949. And I'm going to contextualize that a little bit so you can understand what was happening in the country at the time, because I think to really understand this story and how some kind of story like this could actually happen, which a lot of people continue to come up to me and say, I cannot believe this happened in this country. That's probably the most common thing I ever hear. But I think if you understand the context and what was happening in this country at the time, you'll have a better understanding. And so I'll flip through some of these. These are the images that we often see in textbooks. These are these iconic images of the Jim Crow South. The separate water fountains, separate theaters leading to Jim Crow balconies, sometimes separate theaters themselves. I remember when I was working on Devil in the Grove, I noticed these photographs well into the process. And I remember having this thought, these images do not begin to show what I was seeing in my research. I was discovering through police reports and Freedom of Information Act requests, America, I thought, at its worst. And so when I look back and I saw these pictures of the separate water fountains, I remember having the thought, these images don't begin to tell the real story of what was happening in times of Jim Crow. Those separate water fountains, those made it look to me like Jim Crow was rude and inconvenient for African Americans. Those are not the two words I would use to describe what I was finding in my research. I would use the words brutality and terrorism. And so when I saw those images again after years of research, I remember thinking these images are whitewashing our history. They are in those textbooks to tell a more lukewarm story about what was really happening in this country. And they really do not begin to speak or define the racial terror that I was finding when I would go back and do this research. And so in a way, these images are really a great big lie. They don't really tell the true story of what was happening. And so sometimes it takes these really dark stories and to dive into them to really understand how things truly were in the South. I like to start and talk about Thurgood Marshall in this picture, and I love this picture. It's probably my favorite picture of Thurgood Marshall. This image was taken in the summer of 1946. And if you look at it, you'll see Thurgood Marshall is in Cincinnati, Ohio. He's there to accept the Spingarn Medal, which is the most important contribution by an African American that year. And Marshall is going to be the second youngest to receive this award. Richard Wright was the only one younger to receive it. And here you see him. He's sitting next to the reigning heavyweight champion of the world, Joe Louis, and the commander of the Tuskegee Airmen, Benjamin O. Davis. These are three African Americans in their prime. They're sitting on the stage, And the one thing you notice about Thurgood Marshall, if you've ever seen him before, he's looking pretty thin in this photograph. Has anybody ever seen Thurgood Marshall this thin? Not really. There really are no pictures of that. But there is a reason why Thurgood Marshall is thin in this picture. And if you read the first chapter of Devil in the Grove, you'll know why. This is coming right on the heels of a trial that he was involved in Columbia, Tennessee. 24 African Americans were accused and brought to trial for murder and attempted murder of police. Now you think that's a pretty serious charge. How did that happen? What happened was the police teamed up with Ku Klux Klan members in Columbia, Tennessee, and started firing indiscriminately into black homes and black businesses. And it was considered the first race riot of post-World War II. And it was in Columbia, Tennessee. And basically you had African Americans who had served in the war, who had experienced their share of lynchings in this county. And instead of letting it happen and letting this racial terror envelop their town, they decided to fire back. And they pushed the Klan and the police out. And by firing back, that got them brought up on charges. So Thurgood Marshall went down to Tennessee, and against all odds, he got acquittals of all of those men for that particular thing, which no one was expecting, most of all Thurgood Marshall himself. After the trial, he got into a car with journalists and the other African-American lawyers, and they sped out of town because they sensed trouble. And sure enough, up ahead in a road, there was a roadblock set up by police. And Thurgood Marshall was dragged out of his car, thrown into a police car, and taken down to Duck River. And Marshall said he was in the back of that car, sandwiched between two deputies, and what did he see? A group of men waiting for him under a tree by Duck River. Marshall was absolutely convinced he was about to be lynched that evening. If it wasn't for the other lawyers and journalists in that other car, they circled back, and now there was too many witnesses. They ended up letting Marshall go. But Marshall and the other lawyers had no doubt that Marshall was about to be lynched, all for practicing the law in Columbia, Tennessee. Fortunately, because of the witnesses that were there, Marshall did not meet his death on that river in Tennessee. But think about that, a future Supreme Court justice who's nearly lynched for practicing law. And so that was the environment that this whole book starts out in. This is exactly what was happening in the country at the time. If you look, and you know that at the end of World War II, there was more than 800,000 African-American servicemen who came back from the war. Many of them returned to their homes in the South. And what's interesting about that is many of them were treated with more equality and greater respect while they were in France and Germany and Great Britain than they were in the Jim Crow South. And so when all of these servicemen came home, they did something that's not really well known. They continued to wear, many of them did, continued to wear their military uniforms as a form of silent protest. In other words, they were basically saying to these communities, I was willing to fight and die for this country that I believe in, and now you're expecting me to slip quietly back into that second-class citizenship of Jim Crow? It appalled them, but the really only platform, the only voice they had was continuing to wear that uniform to remind people that they were willing to die for this country. What you don't know is that in the summer of 1946, there was a wave of soldier lynchings across the South. African Americans in their uniforms being lynched. Why? Because it was seen as uppity that they were doing this by reminding people that they served the military. And so they were quickly put into their place. And so that's why you saw this wave of soldier lynchings across the South. One of the men who became the face of that terrible summer of 46, as Thurgood Marshall used to say, was Isaac Woodard. Isaac Woodard was coming home on a bus he finished serving, and he was dragged off the bus basically and beaten so severely by police and deputies that he lost his vision. He lost his consciousness, he lost his memory, but after a couple weeks, he never regained his vision, but he began to remember things about that attack off that Greyhound bus. And he was able to name deputies and sheriffs who were involved. And so in this case, you saw the NAACP get involved. Orson Welles had a national radio show every week, and he talked about Isaac Woodard and what befell him on the side of that bus when he returned home from war. Orson Welles kept talking about it. Woody Guthrie, the folk singer, wrote a song, The Blinding of Isaac Woodard. And here you see Isaac Woodard showing up for a benefit to raise awareness about these soldier lynchings across the South. And there he is with, again, Joe Louis. So that was basically the context of what was happening in this country in the late 1940s following World War II. Thurgood Marshall was known as Mr. Civil Rights, and he would oftentimes not just go out and take these landmark civil rights cases that reached the Supreme Court. What Marshall was also doing was he would get on trains and go down to these antebellum towns in the South and basically be the last line of defense. He would defend black men who were wrongly accused of capital crimes. And if Marshall wasn't there to do it, it was the quickest way to go to the electric chair. And so this was a very dangerous job for Marshall because he often did it alone. He would have to change houses night after night so that the Klan wouldn't find him. His own colleague said, "Thurgood, you can't do this. You are indispensable to the civil rights movement. We have so many cases pending that will affect millions of lives." And Marshall's answer to that was, "These cases matter. These cases save lives." In a lot of ways, Thurgood Marshall was really the forerunner of the Black Lives Matter movement. He was out there defending men who would have gone quickly to the electric chair if he wasn't there to get the trial. He knew he was going to lose the trial, but he would appeal it to the higher court, try to get to that level, fair playing field where he could prevail. And that's why Marshall thought these cases were so important. This is an image that's I've cropped it a little bit to make it, a little bit more palpable, if that's even possible. But the reason I show this image is because Marshall used to see dozens and dozens of these lynching photographs come across his desk. But this is the one, he said, that caused him to wake up in a sweat at night. This is the one that haunted him in his dreams. And this was the lynching of Reuben Stacy down in Fort Lauderdale. And what Marshall said, it wasn't just the bulging eyes or the rope cutting into the neck or the bullet holes in the body of Reuben Stacy. It was the faces of these angelic white children who came dressed in their Sunday best to pose and to laugh around the corpse. And Marshall said that's what he feared the most, was that his time was going to be coming and that he'd find himself hanging from a tree or laying in a ditch as all the white children came out and celebrated his demise. And so this is the particular image that truly haunted him. I'll tell you another story because we're in this neck of the woods. I was doing this talk at the George East, I think it was Hillsborough Bar, a couple of years ago, and a middle-aged black woman came up to me and she said, "Mr. King, I just want to let you know I just read Devil in the Grove, and I have a great-great-uncle who's in your book." And I said, "Oh, who is that?" And she said, "It's Reuben Stacy, the lynching victim at the beginning of your prologue." And I said, "Oh, I planned on actually showing a photograph tonight, and if you're here with your family or any reason you might object, I'd happily take that slide out of my carousel." And she thought about it for a moment, and she said, "No, go ahead and leave it in. I want people to know." And so I did. And as I was talking to her, we talked a little bit more, and she said to me, "You know, I was very aware of Thurgood Marshall and who he was. I was drawn to him because of this case." And she later went on to say that Thurgood Marshall inspired her, so much so that she decided to attend the same law school that Thurgood Marshall attended, Howard University School of Law in Washington, D.C. And she became a lawyer because of Marshall's influence. And she later went on to say she was the first elected African-American female in Hillsborough County. Her name is Lisa Campbell. And so I love to tell that story because this is really a full circle of history. You could imagine this woman's great-great-uncle is lynched at the beginning of this story, and yet here she is, a circuit judge in Florida now. So this is what Thurgood Marshall's staff looked like. 5 lawyers. You'll notice that 2 of them are women. They are not the secretaries. Marshall, at a time where no law firms in Washington, D.C. and New York were really hiring female lawyers, Marshall had 40% of his staff. And that was the direct result of his mother. His mother had a graduate degree from Columbia University in teaching. Marshall was just absolutely convinced that women were entirely as capable as men when it came to these kind of jobs. And Constance Baker Motley, who you see on the right, who later became a federal judge on her own, she talked about the interview she did with Thurgood Marshall. And she said he just told a couple bawdy jokes and then he hired me. And he just had no qualms about hiring a woman lawyer. And Constance Baker Motley became one of the great ones through the entire civil rights movement. And she often referred to Thurgood Marshall as the first feminist of law, which I always thought was funny. So the story I'm going to just briefly talk about is the central story of Devil in the Grove. It all begins when a 17-year-old white girl by the name of Norma Paget makes the accusations that she has been abducted and sexually assaulted by 4 African Americans in Lake County, Florida. The immediate aftermath of those accusations, what you could imagine. The Ku Klux Klan rolled into Lake County and started burning down the black neighborhood of Stuckey Still. Here you see the sheriff, Willis McCall, standing in the center with his trademark Stetson hat, surveying the damage with his prosecutor, Jesse Hunter, and his murderous deputy, James Yates. Willis McCall didn't really need to be surveying these grounds because the night before, when the Klan was burning down the neighborhood, he was the ringleader. So he was the leader of the Klan. So he was right there conducting this. And so that was one of the things that I found in my research was that he wasn't just an innocent bystander or a concerned lawman looking at the ruins. He was there the night before. 3 of the Groveland boys are quickly identified by the sheriff. The sheriff says, I know exactly who they are, and we're able to round up 3 men. This photograph was taken 3 weeks after their arrest. The reason for that? They were beaten so badly, teeth knocked out, welts all over their body, bruises, bloody, that they had to wait for the injuries to heal so that they could photograph them. Here you see Willis McCall gave them a fresh change of clothing and paraded them out saying all 3 of them confessed. And so this was the photograph that was taken of the Groveland 3. There's a 4th Groveland, the 4th member of the Groveland 4. He sees what's happening with the burning neighborhoods and the arresting of these suspects. He knows exactly what he's in for. The accusations that he had sexually assaulted a white woman, a young white woman, he got out of town and he fled. He knew what he was in for. Willis McCall put together a posse of 1,000 men, and they hunted him down and shot him. They were not taking him home alive. Coroner's reports said his body had 400 slugs in it. And so this was the mentality at the time, one of these kind of hunts, basically. The violence got so bad in Groveland that they had to call in the National Guard. Interesting how the media covered this. You can see the 4 electric chairs so that you can tell you how fast this was right after the allegations. There's a quote at the bottom. It says, Florida press calls for Negro blood. And then in quotes it says, if outsiders seek to hamper justice. And that's a direct quote from Sheriff Willis McCall. McCall's message was, don't let these northern black lawyers come down here and make things worse by stirring up trouble. We are going to give these boys a fair trial and then we're going to send them to the electric chair. That was the message that McCall was sending. Fortunately, Thurgood Marshall did not listen to Willis McCall for any legal advice. I wanted to show you this picture because if you look at it, it seems fairly uneventful. However, if you know what's happening in this photograph, which we do, and I'll tell you why, Life magazine sent a photographer down the next day to cover what was being written up as a race riot. It's not a race riot, it was actually an act of terrorism. They sent a photographer down to cover this, and the photographer accompanied Sheriff McCall from Life magazine and went around as he was investigating this and talking to witnesses. And here you see on the left the young man, Lawrence Bertoft. He was the first person to see Norma Paget that very next morning. But he described a very different conversation. He said she came into the store, she was very calm, she sat down, he had some coffee, she was there for 15 minutes, she didn't say anything about any kind of sexual assault or abduction. She said she was just looking for her husband. And if you know what's happening in this photograph, this is what white supremacy looks like. Doesn't always take the forms you're used to seeing, but this is what it looks like, especially in Lake County, and I'll tell you why. They are questioning Lawrence Bertoft, and at one point, Jesse Hunter, the prosecutor, you can see in the suspenders in the foreground, He says, no, Lawrence, no, that's not at all your story. Don't you remember? You heard a girl in a ripped dress standing outside your cafe, and she was screaming, help, help, and then you went down. Don't you remember? And Berthoff is saying, no, you're putting words in my mouth. That's not what happened. See, Berthoff had talked to his mother. Already he'd gotten threats that they were going to run his father's business out and just maybe even burn it down. And he was terrified of that. And so he talked to his mother. And his mother said, Lawrence, just tell the truth. We'll deal with it. Don't worry about your family. Don't perjure yourself. Just tell the truth. But you can see, as the prosecutor's hammering at him, the reaction his words are getting with Sheriff Willis McCall and James Yates in the background. This is the kind of leaning on. In order to support the structure of white supremacy, there was going to be casualties. And this particular casualty was this young cafe owner who had better go along with Sheriff Willis McCall's version, or else. And so this is really a key moment that really bleeds into the trial. I won't go too much into it, but you can see the kind of intimidation and the structures that were put in place. And if you were not on the side of the state, of strong law and order, you were going to be met with this reaction. And what did they do with Lawrence Berthoff? When they realized he wouldn't go along with it, they struck his name from the witness list and hid him from the defense. This is possible exculpatory evidence, just absolutely hidden. And the trial is exactly like that. Perjury, manufactured evidence, you name it. I won't go into the trial too much. It's basically a travesty of justice. But I love this picture because this picture, Thurgood Marshall appealed this case and took it to the US Supreme Court. And this photograph was taken right before oral arguments. And you can see how loose they are. They're all laughing. The reason is they know they're going to win this case. The Supreme Court has already ruled in cases like this Groveland case, so they know there's precedent. They know they're going to be victorious. The Florida Attorney General came up to argue, and he basically just hung his head in shame because he knew it was coming. Sure enough, the arguments happened. When the opinion was announced, Justice Robert Jackson wrote unanimous opinion saying, overturning the Groveland verdict, where the Groveland boys were sentenced to death. He overturned it. He said, this case presents one of the best examples of one of the worst menaces to American justice. On those grounds, I would overturn this. So this is a very big moment, even in Florida history. Now you have the Supreme Court stepping in once again to sort of enforce a way of life. And they're not going to support what was happening in Florida with what happened in that trial. And so Marshall emerges victorious. The Groveland boys have their verdict thrown out, and now there has to be a retrial. Well, you can imagine there's one person in Lake County who's not too happy about that retrial, and that's Sheriff Willis McCall. McCall has basically made a promise in the very beginning of the book when the Klan shows up in the hundreds with weapons and stand outside the jail in Lake County saying, we want them boys, imploring Willis McCall to release the 3 Groveland boys to them where they're going to get their form of justice. Willis McCall, to his great credit, decides that there's not going to be a lynching in Lake County. And so he hides the Groveland boys. And he skirts through this, and he makes the headlines. The New York Times writes him up saying, fast-talking sheriff prevents a lynching in Florida. It's a great moment. But in order to pull that off, he made this promise, this implicit bargain with the people of Lake County. No lynching here. We're going to give them a trial. They'll be found guilty. We'll kill them. Same result. So now that the Supreme Court has overturned this verdict, Willis McCall's confidence, his leadership is in question. And so he has a great idea. On the evening of the retrial, he drives up to Rayford State Prison to pick up the Groveland boys himself and bring them back down for trial. And he does that, and he takes 2 of the Groveland boys in his car, handcuffs them, and starts driving back to the courthouse in Lake County. And then once he reaches Lake County, he takes an unexpected turn down a dirt road. And he opens fire on 2 of the Groveland boys. This photograph is, I think, an iconic image in law enforcement history, civil rights. It has a noir quality to it. And everything you see in this photograph is a lie. And I'll explain. If you look, you can see there's a crumpled Stetson hat, McCall's famous hat, sitting on the hood of that car. And it's crumpled. You can see his clothes, he's disheveled. He's got a little bit of blood trickling down from his face. And he's walking around that car saying, I had to do it. They made a run for it. They were ready to escape. It was either me or him. They came at me. They wanted my gun. I had to fire. I hated to have to do it, but it was either going to be them or me. And this photographer turns up at the scene about 15 minutes after the shooting, sets up that speed graphic camera on a tripod. The flash fires, and suddenly one of the witnesses there says, wait a second, one of those boys just moved. And sure enough, Walter Irvin on the right was still breathing. He was still alive. Next to him was his best friend and Army buddy, Sam Shepard. They were handcuffed together so that he could not go anywhere. Sam Shepard was shot 3 times, killed instantly, once in the head, twice in the chest, died instantly. Irvin was shot once in the side and once in the chest, and yet he was still alive. What he did, he pretended to be dead. He laid next to his friend because he couldn't run anywhere, and he pretended to be dead. And so when that flash fired, what did they do? Immediately called for an ambulance. An ambulance arrived at the scene and took Willis McCall back to the hospital because of his injuries. There are no African Americans who could go in ambulances in Lake County. So an hour later, a hearse shows up from a local black morgue to take Sam Shepard to the morgue and Walter Irvin to the hospital. So now you have Walter Irvin in the hospital and Willis McCall in the same hospital. And McCall is continuing with his story about an escape attempt. Walter Irvin is laying in a hospital bed, and he begins to regain consciousness. And rumors are going around this hospital that Walter Irvin is telling a very different story than the one that Willis McCall said. He's saying it was cold-blooded murder. The next day, Thurgood Marshall arrives in the hospital. He's there with 2 FBI agents, the stenographer, some reporters, and some doctors and medical personnel. And Walter Irvin begins to tell the story. And it's pretty much the same story that Willis McCall was telling, except it diverges at the end. Instead of a flat tire and an escape attempt, Walter Irvin says, Willis McCall just got out of the car, came around, opened the door, shot Sammy Shepard 3 times, pulled him out of the car, and then shot Walter Irvin twice. And that's where he was, when you saw that photograph, that's where he was laying there, handcuffed to his best friend. But then his story gets much more horrible. He goes on to say that he can still hear everything. And he hears Willis McCall get on the radio and say, get back here, James, I got him good, I got him good. And so he's laying there on the ground, and he's bleeding, and he hears another car pull up. It's the deputy, James Yates. And he's trying to be still, he's trying not to breathe, and he hears the footsteps, and then he feels a flashlight flying across his face. And then he hears the words, this one ain't dead yet. And at that moment, Walter Irvin opens his eyes, and Deputy James Yates takes a shot and fires almost at point blank. And that 3rd bullet goes straight through Walter Irvin's neck, but he's still alive. He survives it. And so what does he do? He continues to play dead. That's the only thing he can do. He said at that point, Willis McCall and Deputy Yates started saying, we need to make this look like an escape. Rip my clothes, pull my hair out, hit me. And Irvin is listening to this on the ground. And slowly the witnesses come back. And that's what that photograph that you saw was absolutely about. And so here you see him laying there in the bed. 2 FBI agents are also in that room, and they're listening. And they've already questioned Willis McCall and Deputy James Yates. And they're saying to themselves, if Willis McCall is telling the truth, we know that that bullet is never going to be found because 5 bullets have been recovered from the bodies of Walter Irvin and Sam Shepard. The 6th bullet that went through Walter Irvin's neck will never be found because McCall said he was retreating while they were charging him the whole time. So they know they're never going to find that last bullet because it went clean through the neck. But they know if Walter Irvin's telling the truth, we have an idea where that bullet might be. And so the FBI returns to the crime scene from the prior night, and it's still roped off, and they find the blood stain where Walter Irvin was laying. And they get out a little shovel and start digging. and 10 inches below the surface of that bloodstain, they find a .38 caliber bullet that matches the deputy's gun. This is pure proof of murder and attempted murder by law enforcement agents in Lake County. Probably the most disturbing part of this entire story was that the FBI wrote a damning report saying McCall and his deputy refused to sign an affidavit. They refused to take lie detector tests, whereas Walter Irvin is willing to do both. They say the forensics and the story match, and they do not match Willis McCall's verdict. They recommend to the U.S. Attorney in Tampa that this sheriff and this deputy be brought up on murder charges. And what happens to that entire investigation? It's quashed. It's quashed by the U.S. Attorney, a man named Herbert Phillips, who was the U.S. Attorney based in Tampa, who was himself a segregationist, a white supremacist, and he was the one who made several quashing moments along the trial that aided Sheriff Willis McCall and the state's theory. And now, at this point, this is now being quashed. So, and one of the ways I heard this explained was that this information was never turned over to the defense. Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers never saw these reports, never saw the forensic material and evidence that was in play. This was an incident, I believe, that, you know, sometimes you want to look at a story like this and you want to blame a rogue deputy and an out-of-control sheriff. It's much larger than that. This, at every single stage of this case, Sheriff Willis McCall, someone had his back, whether it was the prosecutor, the judge, the state attorney, and the governor himself. He was enabled, in order to do the things he did, he was enabled by the state of Florida. And so this is not just some bad apple cop and his partner going out taking on these cases on their own. These guys knew that they could get away with this because they had gotten away with it dozens of times. Willis McCall liked to brag that he was investigated 49 times for civil rights charges, and he beat every one of them, and he was right. He did, right up until his end of his 28-year reign, which ended in 1972. Most disturbing part of this, as I said, was that this was never made public. One FBI agent wrote in his report complaining about why this is not being dealt with seriously within the Department of Justice. And he basically heard the words tranquility of the South, those 4 words. In other words, if people really knew what was going on behind the scenes in terms of civil rights, they might riot in the streets. As it was, all of this was sealed. When I filed my Freedom of Information Act request, I was the first person to see these unsealed documents, including the bullets, everything. This had been a story that had basically just died through bureaucracy and red tape. Another part of the story that I want to at least talk about is that there's a great man in Florida by the name of Harry Timur. Not a lot of people know his name. He worked with Thurgood Marshall on this case specifically. He was the president of Florida's NAACP. He brought more than 100,000 African Americans onto the voting rolls, changed the political landscape. Very, very powerful person in Florida history. And his job with Thurgood Marshall in this case was to keep pressure on Willis McCall and the violence. That was getting national headlines. And Harry Timur's job was to just be a thorn in Willis McCall's side. And in the middle of this case, the Ku Klux Klan put a bomb under his house, killing both Harry Timur and his wife within a week of each other on Christmas 1951. I can say that he was effectively the first modern civil rights martyr in the United States. There's a monument in Alabama to martyrs of the civil rights movement, and Harry Timur's name isn't even on it. I think it's part of the reason. I think it was people didn't quite know what to think of Florida. It's south of the South. People just didn't know what to think of it. And so Harry Timur is sort of a forgotten person. We know the names of Medgar Evers, who's a decade later, and he was a field secretary. This was the president of the Florida NAACP, and Americans barely know his name. I like to just sort of end on this note that a lot of times people think this is ancient history. It seems so long ago. Jack Greenberg, the Caucasian white man in the front, this is one of his first cases. And I had the pleasure of speaking to him at Columbia, where he taught law school. And he told me, he stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima, but he was never more terrified than when he was down in Lake County on this case. It was his first real criminal case, and he said, I felt like a coward because I'm a white man, I don't even live here. I can't imagine what people like Harry Timur have to live with constantly in order to stand up and fight for equal justice. So that was a really valuable conversation that he was able to tell me about. Of course, Thurgood Marshall, I won't give away the ending because there's some powerful moments that still happen, but Thurgood Marshall ended up touring the country talking about this Groveland case. In fact, they raised so much money from the Groveland case, it was no longer even necessary, needed to use. What they ended up doing was they funneled all of that excess money and put it towards Brown versus Board, which was just coming up at the same time. And that is why Brown versus Board, the legal document, the brief that was filed on that, is considered one of the great civil rights documents in American history. It was because Marshall and his men had all this resources. They could hire experts. They could bring in sociologists. I know Frank would like that especially. They brought in sociologists, historians, lawyers, and former clerks to the Supreme Court to put together this document calling for the end of segregation in public schools. And usually I do this talk and it's so downbeat because of the things that happened, but I would like to say there was something that positive that happened just this year in January. The Groveland boys, all of them were pardoned by the governor and the clemency board in January of this year. I think there's a lot of people who thought they'd never live to see the day that this would happen. And it was because, I think, the reason we're here, the power of storytelling. This book started making its way around the book clubs in the Florida legislature. And you started to see the Democrats read it first, and they said, we're going to have a contest. We are going to get as many Democrats as we can to co-sponsor this bill and finally bring this forward. And then the Republicans in the legislature said, we have more Republicans. We're reading the book too. We're going to have our own little club, and we're going to challenge you to see who gets more co-sponsors. I got a call to come down to Florida and sit with the family members of the Groveland boys up in the balcony. And it was amazing. The Speaker of the House, Richard Corcoran, stood up and he said, I understand there's been some kind of contest to see who get more co-sponsors. I don't know what the final tally is. Let's do it now. And it was 117-0 for co-sponsors. They voted shortly after there, another 117-0 vote. And it was a beautiful moment. They all stood, hands on the heart, faced the member of the Groveland boys in the balcony and said, on behalf of the state of Florida, we apologize for the grave injustice that came upon your families long ago. It's way too late to correct this. And they promised that they would pardon them afterward, after the apology, and move towards posthumous exonerations, which is now in the process. I think it was a great moment in Florida government because you saw this, it was nonpartisan coming together to sort of correct this grave injustice. And, I was personally moved by it because I had people coming up to me at book talks whispering in my ear saying, we're going to be doing this. We're going to take care of this. And I'm like, well, I don't know who you are. And then the next thing I hear is Marco Rubio's chief of staff. And sure enough, Marco Rubio stood up on the Senate floor after the 2018 election and basically said, now is the time to pardon the Groveland boys. And that resonated. And some of the commissioners and clemency board, the board agreed to go along with this. And then Governor DeSantis said pretty much the same thing. This is going to be our first order of business once I take office. And sure enough, in his second day of office, we all went to Tallahassee, and the Groveland boys were officially pardoned, and exonerations are coming next. So I'm going to end it right there on a really upbeat note, and we'll move on to the conversation aspect of this evening with Judge Charles Williams. Oh, sorry, wait a minute. Took that right out of your hand.
That's okay.
All right.
Gilbert, how you doing?
I'm doing good now.
I want everybody to know my first name isn't Judge. I'm actually a real judge, believe it or not. And how I got to know Gilbert is a long story. I actually met him here when he was first introducing his book at a book fair here in St. Pete. But I will tell you that he has been a part of the judicial education portion of the judiciary here in Florida. His book, Devil in the Grove, has been mandatory reading for all of our judges, and I've had the privilege of introducing his work to all the new judges. I want to talk a little bit about Florida, because certainly you talked a little bit about it in the introduction, that Florida was not considered the South, not that we were Massachusetts, but we were certainly not considered like Alabama or Mississippi. And before I start, I'm going to let him catch his breath, just to give you an idea of what the attitude of Florida was as it related to integration and segregation. Not long after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which came out in 1954, there was an individual by the name of Virgil Hawkins who tried to integrate the University of Florida Law School, my alma mater. The Florida Supreme Court is the highest court of the land. And in all of its attempts to prevent Virgil Hawkins from enrolling at the University of Florida, I thought it was important for me to share to you the attitude of the Florida Supreme Court shortly after the Brown decision and during the time when Virgil Hawkins tried to enroll, and then we'll talk about Florida as a state. Just like Gilbert's book sometimes reads like fiction, this actually reads like fiction until you realize this is a decision that the Florida Supreme Court made, and I'm going to read to you. I wanted to shorten it, but by shortening it, I take a little bit away from it. But this is, in denying Virgil Hawkins admission to the University of Florida, they touch on the subject of segregation. And this is within the body of the opinion. And this is by the Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court. I might venture to point out in this connection that segregation is not a new philosophy generated by the states that practice it. It is and has always been the unvarying law of the animal kingdom. The dove and the quail, the turkey and the turkey buzzard, the chicken and the guinea, it matters not where they are found, they are segregated. Place the horse, the cow, the sheep, the goat, and the pig in the same pasture, and they instinctively segregate. The fish in the sea segregates into schools of their kind. When the goose and duck arise from the Canadian marshes and take off at the Gulf of Mexico and other points south, they are segregated. They are always found segregated. And when God created man, he allotted each race to his own continent according to color. Europe to the white man, Asia to the yellow man, Africa to the black man, and America to the red man. But we are now advised that God's plan was in error and must be reversed, despite the fact that the gregariousness that this has been the law of the land since the beginning of time. That was the majority opinion of the Florida Supreme Court in denying Virgil Hawkins admission to the University of Florida's law school. So I'd like to start, first of all, Gilbert, by talking about what you found Florida to be like in terms of comparisons to places like Alabama and Mississippi, which traditionally get the bad press when it comes to race relations.
Right, and I think that's a really, by the way, I don't think that particular justice had much of a STEM background.
No. And unfortunately, one of the buildings at the University of Florida Law School is named after him. So there is a movement to change it.
Yes. One of the things that I found kind of interesting when I was reading this, because one of the phrases that comes up in Devil in the Grove is South of the South. People didn't look at Florida as part of the Cotton Belt South, so it was just different from Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina. It was seen as south of the South, and so when you had these atrocities come up in Florida, they just didn't catch on the way they might have had in Mississippi and Georgia. And I point to a couple of cases like that. There's a case that happens in Live Oak where a 15-year-old African-American kid makes the vital mistake of signing a Christmas card to a white clerk about his age. And when she shows it to her father, the father, who's a constable in Live Oak, gets one of his deputy friends, and they go down and they just grab this kid, restrain him, tie him up, and bring him to a cliff over the Suwannee River, and basically give him a choice, a bullet or jump in the water and drown. And he jumps in the water and drowns. He does this in front of his father, who's there to witness this, so that he has some message to bring back to the community. Thurgood Marshall and Harry Timur got involved in this case, and it went nowhere. They could not get any traction with the Department of Justice, no investigation. And so no one was ever punished for this, even though the evidence was clear that this was a lynching. And it was seen as just one of those Florida stories because, we know Emmett Till, very similar thing happened to him a little bit later. And that became a signifying moment in the civil rights movement with the open casket and all the coverage of Emmett Till's death. And yet the things that were happening in Florida, like this Groveland story, I mean, I think all of us have probably heard of the Scottsboro boys and the Scottsboro case in Alabama in 1931. Well, this Groveland case is far more dramatic and dangerous, and yet no one really knew about it. When I read Thurgood Marshall's biography, it was getting like a paragraph. It wasn't written about because here's Thurgood Marshall. We write about landmark civil rights cases and his Supreme Court days. So the state of Florida, I don't know, later on it had a progressive governor in Leroy Collins. So I think when people looked at it, they said, that's not the South. That's Leroy Collins down there. He's a friend of, later LBJ. And so I think people were just confused about it. But here's the fact. On a per capita basis, Florida was the most dangerous state to be black in. It had more lynchings per capita than any other state in the Union. And so that's a real fact. And so it became the most dangerous place to be black.
I also want to talk about the aspect of domestic terrorism. We talk about terrorism, and you mention it, and we always think of terrorism in terms of international events. But talk a little bit after your research on this book and researching some of the other incidents about the domestic terrorism as it related to the civil rights movement and how it was used.
Right. Well, I mean, I think there was probably no greater signifier of domestic terrorism than the act of a lynching. So a lynching is done as a public spectacle, bodies left hanging, it's a message, it's usually narrowly defined, so it's a violation of community and social mores, taken on by an act with two or more people, a mob if possible, but had to be two or more people. And so the definition of a lynching became kind of narrow. And so I think we have something like 4,700 documented lynchings that the Equal Justice Initiative has been able to identify. My thinking on that is that does not begin to tell the story of the racial terror. That only covers those instances that fit those narrow guidelines. But what things I'm finding in my research, horrible stories, but I often look at coroner's reports. And I look at these kind of cases that are kind of buried in the FBI files. And I'll give you an example. And this was a particular case I saw in Louisiana, which I think was sort of basically a composite of what I see in a lot of Jim Crow states. And so basically, late at night, a deputy arrives at an African-American home, knocks on the door, the father answers, and the deputy says, I need to see your son. Tatel was his name. I need to talk to him. Father calls his 18-year-old son to the door, and the deputy says, come with me. And they start walking out into the darkness, and when they get far enough away from the house, a single gunshot rings out. Father comes running out. What happened? What happened? Sees his son laying on the grass. The deputy says, he went for my gun. That goes in a coroner's report. Guess who picks the coroner jury? The sheriff in that community. I mean, that's how it's done. And so there was just no community interest whatsoever in questioning the word of law enforcement. And so these things happen constantly in the South, and they're not showing up as statistics. So I don't think that lynching statistic, as important as it is, begins to really describe the racial terror that communities were experiencing at the hands of law enforcement.
So if you combine police killing or police murder with lynching, those numbers actually would probably...
I'll just give you an example of Lake County. So I went to the Peace and Justice Memorial, the lynching memorial in Montgomery, and every county that had a lynching is there, and the number of lynchings. And I got to the Lake County granite thing that's hanging overhead, and there's only 3 lynchings in Lake County. Sheriff Willis McCall on his own was believed to have killed 24 African Americans on his own in a very short period of time, given the history of how long lynching was active. And he was probably the worst sheriff in Lake County, but there were others. And these things happen constantly. Missing people, I saw those constantly in the deputies' reports, saying that all these people are just missing all of a sudden. African Americans are missing. during the times of Jim Crow, and the law enforcement just says, he probably just migrated north to get a better job. You'll get a postcard, something like that. The truth of the matter is the families knew that, one of their family members was pushing for unionization in the orange groves. That was not met with a lot of grace and welcomeness.
Let's talk about that because, there's been obviously 1619 has been the anniversary, the 400-year anniversary of slavery. There's been great articles in the New York Times. Let's talk about the economic impact of the Jim Crow laws and the role that the sheriff, in your book, Sheriff McCall, but probably sheriffs all over Florida and the South, their role in forcing the economic engine of these communities.
Right, and that's one of the things when I started working on Devil in the Grove, I thought, follow the money, that's where the power is going to be. And I started following that path, and I was looking at the wealthy white citrus owners and how they went about their business. They clearly put Willis McCall into office. He had a fruit inspector background. He was a strong law and order man. He would have been a good pick to sort of keep labor in line. Basically what that means is like any union activists that come along, they just basically rough them up and send them on their way. They did not want unionization. They wanted low wages. And so that's what their job was. But there's, interestingly enough, I talked about this a little bit earlier, there were laws on the books that made it real easy for the sheriffs to prosper from this kind of enforced white supremacy. And these are the worker fight laws. And they were still on the books well after World War II. And so what they led to was a bail bond racket, debt slavery. This law on the book, if you were a male over the age of 18 and you were not working that day and you were not in the military, the sheriff had the right, by law, to pick you up, arrest you, and throw you in jail. And that could be after you worked 6 days a week and you were resting on the 7th day. You could still arrest that. And so you could see how that was used to just sort of put your boot on the neck of African Americans in your community. It was a form of terrorism because all of a sudden the leading breadwinner in your family is just thrown in jail for something arbitrary as not working on a Sunday. And so what they would do, the sheriffs would do, is once they get like 10 or 12 bodies, they'd call up the citrus foremen and say, I got 10 workers for you. And they would have to work picking oranges for free and pay off the fine, which would go right to the sheriff. And people don't realize, by law, the sheriff got to keep those fines personally. He could use that for building a house. And so he was totally incentivized to do this. And they wasn't doing it a lot with white people. They were basically doing this in the black communities. And this is just a form of debt slavery that was enforced by law.
We're going to talk a little bit, and then I assume we'll open it up for questions. But let's talk a little bit about the justice system as it related to what was going on between 47 and 57, the time of your two books. But the influence that the sheriff had and the power structure had and white supremacy had in affecting the justice system.
Well, I mean, that was the thing. You were basically using this not very sophisticated form of machinery in order to keep African Americans off your jury. To be honest with you, when African Americans did get onto a jury, a lot of times they were so threatened themselves that they didn't dare break in order to solve some kind of racial crime. But for the most part, in the South, for a very long time, you would just basically see prosecutors going around hand-picking African Americans like this, saying, he's a good Negro, I want him on the grand jury. He's a good Negro. And Marshall would sit there and go, if the prosecutor says he's a good Negro, we don't want him. And so that was and so what would they do? They'd put him on the grand jury and then they'd use peremptory challenges to erase them and skirt them off the jury. So that was a way of controlling an all-white jury. And basically, you had a community that was just unwilling to stand up to law enforcement and the prosecutor in these communities. And you see it later on. I write about it in the next book, Beneath the Ruthless Sun, where in 1972, this is 1972 we're talking about, Willis McCall, still sheriff, kicks to death a black mentally disabled prisoner in one of his cells who was being held in jail for basically a driving violation. And because he did this in front of witnesses, he was suspended from office by Reuben Askew, and then he was brought up on murder trial. He was actually indicted. And they went through the trial, was moved to Orange County, change of venue, and the jury deliberated for about an hour and acquitted Willis McCall. which was no surprise. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement did an investigation. They thought they had an absolutely airtight case against Willis McCall, given all the witnesses. But in the middle of the trial, one of the witnesses against McCall disappeared. The other had his head blown off outside a bar in Lake County. So this was what it was. This is the leader of the Klan, and now he's on trial, and 12 jury members, 12 white jury members, are going to determine his guilt. Of course, they voted to acquit. And when the FDLE interviewed them afterwards, to a man, they basically said, he was probably guilty, but we got to live down here. And so that was the terror that you faced.
And certainly we talk now about confessions and admissions, but it was routine in your research from your book that confessions were routinely beaten out of people. And talk a little bit about that and how it affected this particular case.
Right, well, this was just a form of doing police work. I mean, there was in 1947, President Truman commissioned an investigation into civil rights and law enforcement, and they found that there were certain police forces in the South that started every questioning with a beating. Like, that was it. Everything started with a beating. And so this was the mentality. You were talking about African Americans in the criminal justice system. They were seen as disposable people. And so that just permeated throughout the criminal justice system. It was a very, very difficult nut to crack in order to bring justice about. Confessions were they weren't worth the paper that was held up. In this particular case, Willis McCall stood on the courthouse steps with blank pages and said, "These are the confessions of the Groveland boys." Well, what he didn't say is that the night before, they took the Groveland boys to the basement under the courthouse, strung them up with handcuffs to pipes, and beat them so severely that 2 of them confessed just to stop the beating. Walter Irvin was one that just passed out from the pain, but he refused to confess. But this was a very common thing. And to be honest with you, it took a Supreme Court decision in 1940, Chambers versus Florida. It always comes back to Florida.
It's always Florida.
And basically that decision by the Supreme Court outlawed coerced confessions. You could no longer beat a suspect but before 1940, you could. And it also happened afterwards. And there was another case that reached the Supreme Court where they had to determine how many hours was it okay if you beat someone at 5 o'clock and then you questioned them at 8 o'clock, was 3 hours enough to say it was not coerced anymore? And I think Justice Douglas said, anyone who thinks that a 3-hour space between a beating is a legitimate confession doesn't understand law or human dynamics.
And finally, and then we can open it up for questions. As a lawyer and now a judge, the judiciary and the judicial systems, it's a love-hate relationship. The same court that gave you Plessy versus Ferguson and Dred Scott gives you Brown v. Board. What's your impression of the courts, how they were influential or not influential in shaping current policies and taking care of some of the issues that you saw in Devil in the Grove? I mean, have they done their jobs?
Yeah, I mean, that's a two-sided answer, but I just, one of the things that you touched on, which I think is really important, because sometimes, I mean, when I first went out with Devil in the Grove, I went down to Central Florida, and it was about 2 weeks after Trayvon Martin was killed, and I remember just the kind of questions I was getting, nothing has changed. It's the same thing, nothing has changed. And I remember thinking, you know, if you've read Devil in the Grove and you look back at that trial, you understand that the criminal justice system that you saw on display in that trial, both trials, is not even recognizable to what we have today. I mean, it just, you had moments where I can just, you know, perjury, objections were never sustained on the side of the defense. It was just basically a conspiracy to convict. And so if you look at that case, it just doesn't seem recognizable to what you're familiar with. If you've watched television, read books, you know what the law requires, and that system just looks so antiquated and ancient that it just doesn't seem real. But I think you really have to thank people like Thurgood Marshall and some of these people who fought for the changes in the courtrooms. Those were their offices. You know, Thurgood Marshall was out there making schools better and voting rights and restrictive covenant laws, but he was also out trying to reform the criminal justice system. Definitely it's not near perfect, but it's so much better than it was, and I I really attribute that to the work of Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers fighting for those 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment cases, because there was no better dream team you could possibly imagine than the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. They were the ones that really transformed the criminal justice system. I think now there's different problems. It's more subtle. You have mass incarceration. You have minimum sentences and mandatory guidelines. And the fight is much more subtle. It's much more difficult. It's not so much about wrong or right anymore. It's been layered with these subtleties, which makes, I think, it a more challenging time to be a lawyer and to be a judge. But there's no question that things have gotten infinitely better from the days of 1940s and 50s.
And quite honestly, Thurgood Marshall played for the Supreme Court in terms that he knew that he was going to probably lose the first couple of rounds of these legal fights and would find recourse in the Supreme Court. That being said, just for a talking point, the most recent U.S. Supreme Court that deals with racism and jury selection, the Supreme Court took on a Mississippi prosecutor for repeatedly excluding blacks from a murder trial. In fact, he had little code names for black jurors. And so surprisingly, that case was reversed because of the striking of black jurors. Brett Kavanaugh wrote the opinion of it. Clarence Thomas wrote a dissenting opinion on it, but that's another story. So we do still see that the Supreme Court's still struggling with these issues.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right about that.
From years ago. How has this affected you personally? Because certainly you're a detail person. Anybody that's read your book, you've gotten into the weeds on all of this. How has it changed your outlook growing up in New York, researching, understanding these problems from a personal point of view and your interaction with some of the people that you write about? How has it changed you personally?
Well, it's just something that's just so gratifying. I consider it a great gift. You know, not too long ago, I was doing other things. I was a photographer and sort of found something late in life that I really love and really care about and want to continue doing for the rest of my life. And it brings me into the circle of people that I mentioned, like Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative, like you, who I can talk about these kind of issues with people that, you know, aren't just the guys I play basketball with. They're leaders in civil rights. And so I think it's just been a great gift, and I sort of am determined to not waste it and to continue writing about these subjects and continue educating myself and hopefully finding some really important stories that sort of give context to where we are as a nation. And so I've considered myself extraordinarily lucky and extraordinarily, I feel an enormous weight at times to sort of get some of these stories right and to sort of, you know, how many more, these books take me almost 6 years to write. How many more do I really have in me? You know, it sort of makes you question your mortality. But I think these stories, I think there's nothing more important and nothing I could see myself ever doing. So,
do you think the role of history in your writing is an instrument for social change? And if it is an instrument of social change, how would you like it to be used?
You know, I really do, and I think that the whole storytelling aspect is so important. I always go back to something that Brian Stevenson said when he talks about the need for truth and reconciliation in this country. How, unlike Nazi Germany and South Africa, where they've had Truth and Reconciliation Commission to sort of give immunity to people who may have been involved in some horrible things during apartheid, and say, come forward because we don't ever want the truth to be in question. And we want accountability, and we don't ever want to do this again. And before you can have reconciliation, you need to get to the truth. And I think it's the role of writers and attorneys since we don't have a commission like this in the United States, to do what it is in our power to change things and to maybe rewrite some of these stories for the greater good. And so I do think that it's extraordinarily important.
How do you, because I will tell you this, when we asked you to come down and talk to some of the judges about this story, there were judges that pushed back, that said, you know, here we go again. White people have to feel guilty about something that they had nothing to do with. I wasn't around. I wasn't born in the 30s and 40s. Why do I have to listen to this? Why do they have to listen to it?
I mean, my answer to that is we all live here. Don't we want a better country? Don't we think that having an innocent person in jail is just intolerable? How that's not acceptable? Do we want people beaten before they're before they confess to something? Are these things we can all agree on as Americans, that we don't want prosecutorial misconduct? We don't want enabled perjury in a trial. We don't want manufactured evidence. We don't want to determine the guilt through totally fraudulent methods. I mean, one of the things when I got up to testify at the clemency hearing for the Groveland boys, Norma Paget, who you saw in the picture, is still alive. And so, you know, that tells you this is not ancient history. And she was brought in, and I tried to interview her about 10 years ago. Her message to me was, let sleeping dogs lie. She hadn't talked to anybody since that trial, and she didn't want to talk to me about it. And I kind of wish she did, because I was actually a sympathetic ear for her. I was, you know, to me it was like the men in her life that did her wrong. They were the one that put that story in place and took it to the most violent extremes. And so when I look back at that moment where in the testimony, it wasn't really about he said, she said. It didn't come down to that. When Governor DeSantis and his clemency board ruled on this and they voted 4-0 for this bipartisan level, they were basically acknowledging the grave injustice that happened in that courtroom. That was the state of Florida's fault. That was not Norma Paget, her words, that caused these pardons. It was what happened in that trial and all the surrounding efforts in that trial that was a grave injustice, and that's what they were pardoning.
Okay, I think at this time we're going to try to open it up for some questions. So there'll be some people with some mics, and if you have any questions, I'm sure they'll all be directed toward Gilbert, not me. So.
Gilbert's narrative was about bias in the justice system, and the judge quoted a Supreme Court justice some years later with evidence of similar bias. So in view of the Central Park Five and issues of contemporary injustice and bias in the system, I'd like to ask the judge the question he asked Gilbert. What about bias, racial bias, in today's justice system, and is it really not so bad like Gilbert suggests?
You know, I will say this, you know, because I am a judge, I have to defend the justice system to a certain point. I still think our system of justice in America is the greatest system in the world. However, I would be naive if I did not tell you that bias still exists. It plays a big part in terms of what's going on in terms of sentencing. There's no doubt that judiciaries across America are representative of just basically people, and people have bias. The Florida judiciary, however, has taken a step in terms of having its judges get grips on bias. We have mandatory bias training. We understand that we have implicit bias, even if we may not have explicit bias. All of us, at some point, everybody in this room, has certain implicit bias. What you have to train yourself as a judge is, first of all, to recognize that that bias may truly exist and to move beyond it. But certainly I would be naive and certainly not telling you the truth if I did not tell you that if you walk into any jail in any community or walk into any prison, you're going to see a disproportionate number of people of color. That has always been the case in this country. And until we get the grips on some sentencing reform, which the good news is it's coming. I think even conservatives and liberals can agree that the current incarceration rates are just ridiculous. America incarcerates more people than anybody in the world. So that's coming. But I think that, yes, to answer your question, yes, there is a bias problem in the criminal court system, in law enforcement, and the prosecutorial decisions that are made, and even in the defense attorneys, how they deal with clients. So we found that to be true, and we're working very hard to try to prevent it.
First of all, I'd like to say I enjoyed the conversation. I think there's one important factor that needs to be taken into consideration, and that is in 1964, we had the first public defender offices created by virtue of a United States Supreme Court decision that once again came out of Florida. I think that the public defender's office.
Is that Gideon? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Having the Supreme Court say that every criminal defendant that faced the possibility of going to jail deserved an attorney made a tremendous shift Now, the fact, in the way in which our criminal justice system operated, because prior to that time, you had no right to an attorney. And we're talking 1964, which is not that much long ago. But in 1972, when I became a public defender in the Alameda County Public Defender's Office in the Berkeley, Oakland, California area, I was the first black woman to be so. And we still do not have an integrated criminal justice system. We have a system in which you have black defendants for the most part, not always, but a large number. We have people incarcerated for relatively minor offenses if you're an African American person. And we do have a problem with the manufacturing of evidence against black criminal defendants. We have a problem with shooting black suspects, no matter how young they are. And it would be very, very naive to say that we have a criminal justice system that works well. In my opinion, it does not work well. It works extremely poorly. And we have too many people incarcerated falsely. And when I tell people that they don't believe me, and I will say, you would be amazed at how many clients I had as a public defender who were quite innocent. They weren't even guilty. It's not a question of asking me how I could defend a guilty person. At least 80% of the time, my clients were innocent, which made my job that much more difficult. So I'm making more of a comment than a question, but I do question why we talk about issues that involve the entire community, whether it's African Americans, or whether it's Caucasian, or whether it's Latinos. And we have these wonderful events such as tonight, and you look around the room, and you just do not see an integrated setting. And there has to be some way to encourage not just racial reconciliation, which I truly believe in, and truth and reconciliation, which also has to occur, but there must be more participation and outreach to people from various areas of the community so that the entire community can benefit from an evening such as this. And perhaps this is just a college event, which would explain the fact that it's not so integrated. But I think that we as a group of people should look around ourselves wherever we find ourselves and try to figure out whether or not we've reached out to make sure that our community that we're participating in for any event includes everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, I had basically a follow-up on both of those two comments, which is if you bring it all the way forward to today, how prevalent is a Project Innocence-like situation? How many incarcerated people do we have who were wrongfully incarcerated because of all the made-up evidence and forced confessions and so forth? And how do you retrospectively address the problems that caused, the unfairness that caused?
Well, I can talk about that a little bit, and I'm sure Judge Williams has a few things to say, but I've been encouraged because I'm working on a new story that fits a lot of what we've been talking about tonight, but it's more modern. So it's somebody who's still in prison right now. I've been encouraged to see that the birth of these conviction integrity review units here in Florida. There's 3 of them now. I think there's about to be a 4th in South Florida. But basically, they're an arm of the prosecutor's office that are tasked with looking back at cases of innocence, where there's been complaints of innocence. And not things where maybe the appellate issue was wrong or there was a flaw in some kind of decision, but actual innocence. And they receive hundreds of cases that come across their desk, and they have to look at the cases that they think they can pursue. And so one of them, I just talked to the prosecutors up in Jacksonville, and it was just a really interesting case from 43 years ago that just it wasn't even any real prosecutorial like Brady violations where they didn't turn over evidence to the defense. It was just this tunnel vision, like, we're going with this narrative, that doesn't fit my narrative, don't call that witness, don't call that witness, get the conviction. And what happens after years, you start to, people talk, and sometimes other people, like you saw in that Central Park 5 case, someone comes forward, confesses, and it's actually his DNA at the crime scene. And so these conviction integrity review units, I think, have been embraced within these districts that look at these cases, and now it's, fellow prosecutors looking at these cases, going back over it and saying, you didn't get this right. And why is this important? Because the entire integrity and the credibility of the justice system is really riding on this, not how many convictions you get, but whether you're putting innocent people in jail. And so I think this is going to spread, and it's going around more and more in the country. Florida's really catching on to it. Right now it seems to be in mostly the really big urban areas, but I wouldn't be surprised to see it spread, maybe even some state force that could look at these cases and just to ensure that innocent people have a chance, because it happens more than you'd like to know.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that, we do know that there's one in Hillsborough County. These have to be led by the prosecutors. I think if you read Gilbert's book, you'll see how powerful, next to the sheriff, the prosecutor is the most powerful person in the criminal justice system. But the prosecutors who make the decision to convict people, to accuse people, and also can make the decision to acquit people on their own, have to be convinced to do this. I don't think the Pinellas County prosecutor feels the same way as the Hillsborough County prosecutor, so you're not going to have a unit like that in Pinellas. So you have to, as voters, decide, and a prosecutor's an elected office, those are the types of demands I think that you have to make of your prosecutors to make certain that these things don't get slipped through the cracks.
I'll be brief. Thank you. My name is G. Van Gils. I feel so lucky that there's so much positive energy here in this room tonight, the work that you've done, both of you. And I want to be positive, but I'm haunted by the Charlottesville situation. I'm haunted by things that we've seen in our current society, not the Jim Crow era. We like to think about that we're making progress. But I want to know your opinion about our current society. These things that happened in the past happened out of some kind of primal instinct or whatever that was that made people treat other people in those ways. And I want to know your opinion about where are we today? Have we evolved at all? Are we going to see the end of it? Are these things that we're hearing and seeing in Charlottesville the last gasp? Or is this actually something that's just allowed to be seen? I really want to know your opinion about that, because you've been studying it and I haven't. I just feel, the pain of that. I want to know what you think about it.
Sure, I'll take a stab at that, because it was something I noticed when I was writing my last book, because the story takes place in the wake of Brown versus Board, 1954. And so, just so you know, the Brown versus Board was argued by Thurgood Marshall. It's probably considered the most important civil rights case of the 20th century to reach the Supreme Court. This was the desegregation of public schools. It was a 9-0 verdict by the U.S. Supreme Court, unanimous, trying to come out in favor of this bit of equality. What a lot of people don't realize is the aftermath of Brown versus Board. What happened? What was the reaction to Brown versus Board? Well, you saw the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. You saw white citizens' councils pop up in 11 southern states, more than 300,000 members. These were, as Thurgood Marshall described them, as the Uptown Klan. They were politicians, they were lawyers, they were doctors, they were upstanding members of the community. And now they're all gathering into these white citizens' councils opposed to segregation. And a lot of people think white citizens' councils weren't violent. They were actually violent. And they would constantly threaten school board members, parents themselves, to not send their children to these schools. Racial terror and bombings increased in the wake of 1954. So when you see these two giant steps forward with Brown versus Board, almost immediately you see one big step backwards to return to racial terror and the longing for white supremacy. Try to connect these cycles of history. Without getting political, we'll look at the election of President Barack Obama. Twice elected, both of them near landslide victories. Why is that significant? because this country elected its first African-American president. And you know it's significant because you see leaders like John Lewis and civil rights leaders who have been around for a long time saying they'd never thought they'd live to see a day where this nation would elect an African-American, and it happened. Was there a reaction to that? That 2 steps forward? You could say there was. I would say that Charlottesville is a reason for that, where you have people willing to go without masks and expressing anti-Semitic views and racist views. And you see this sort of, I would call it a last gasp, but I'm not confident enough to call it a last gasp. I think it's another step backwards. But I would remind people that in the wake of Brown versus Board, and in the late 50s, when you saw that racial terror and the dividing of the races and the relationship really go sour, you also saw another reaction, and that was the civil rights movement. And I also believe that there's going to be an equal reaction that's based on demographics, changing demographics the same way it was. And I do believe that you will see another 2 steps forward, but I'm not confident enough to say that there won't be another step backwards. But I think it's always getting a little bit better.
I will say this, and this isn't Gilbert and I first rodeo. We've spoken together many times. The most difficult conversation to have is about race, right? I mean, you can talk about everything else, but it's a very difficult conversation. I think the first step is being comfortable, or at least making yourself comfortable talking about the issue first. We dance around it, we talk about it in these flowery political terms, but really a lot of it is just a conversation about skin color, why you think I'm different, and why do I think you're different. Things like what we're doing tonight certainly help, but I think that you have to have those basic conversations in order to make any progress at all, and so many of us are afraid to do it. So many of us are afraid to talk about the past. So many of us are afraid to feel guilty because, just like those judges who don't want to talk about what happened in the 40s or 50s. We have to make ourselves comfortable talking about race, and I think that's step 1.